Hello, everyone, and welcome to our review of our Week 2 activities. So, we're going to start off with number one changes. Describe the transition from ancient civilizations, the Assyrians, the Egyptians, the Minoans, for example, to later classical civilizations such as the Persians and the Greeks. In general, what differences do you notice between these earlier and later cultures? Of course, we saw this week, particularly in chapter 2, how there was this transition from kind of the very earliest examples of large stratified states that we studied last week, and about the same time period, in the early kind of Iron Age, late Bronze Age, around 1100 or so, they all generally kind of the old civilizations tend to collapse very, very quickly, right? Or at least they begin transitioning in a lot of cases to later iterations, where you see the Babylonian Empire come to an end, you see the Egyptian Empire through the Battle of the Sea Peoples and so forth come to an end. You see the Minoans and the Mycenaeans, the early Greek civilizations, both relatively coming to a quick conclusion. And it takes a couple hundred years for essentially these kind of large stratified states to start popping up once again. But you very quickly do. For example, the Neo-Assyrian Empire, the Neo-Babylonian Empire. But what we really see the transition to kind of more classical civilizations with sort of the large empire building accomplished by Cyrus the Great in the form of the First Persian Empire, and of course the spread of Greek culture through much of the Mediterranean world, beginning with the Greek peninsula, but certainly eventually goes far beyond that, eventually getting to, of course, the Hellenistic world, which essentially incorporates most of the ancient Near East and Egypt, which we have already discussed up until this point in time. So as a part of that process, you see one of the big differences being kind of the size and scope of the civilizations we're talking about, with the Mesopotamian civilizations being very geographically bound between the Tigris and the Euphrates rivers, with the Egyptian civilization being very much kind of geographically constrained around the Nile River. You begin to see cultural groups and cultural influences spreading to a wider and wider geographical region. For example, the Persian Empire forms an empire that goes from the Mediterranean to India, for example. You see, like I said, Greek culture spreading throughout the Mediterranean Sea, and eventually, after Alexander the Great, spreading throughout the rest of the Near East region as well, being very, very influential within those regions. At the same point in time that you're seeing a large increase in the size and scope of these cultural groups, you're also seeing an increase in complexity oftentimes of these civilizations. And the complexity is really referring to social dynamics, for example. It's referring to that oftentimes these are becoming much more multicultural in nature, so that there are oftentimes multiple cultural groups operating within the same broader culture. For example, the Persian Empire brings in cultures of the Persians, the Medians, the Lydians, the Babylonians, and that really are able to form a cohesive governing group and a cohesive ideology that incorporates all these various cultures within them. And the Greek culture, if you think about it, is very multicultural as well, because even though there's this kind of broad idea of what Greek culture is, you can see particularly, for example, with the differences between Athens and Sparta, that there's really a lot of variation and very different cultures between these Greek city-states themselves. I mean, it's hard to depict two different groups of people than the Spartans and the Athenians, right? After studying them this week, but they're still both considered part of Greek culture. So the civilizations in general are becoming more multicultural, becoming more complex. They're becoming with kind of an increased and sometimes more rigid classifications of stratification, and all of these are sort of good examples of these changes that are going on. And these are really reflected in other main ways. Religion, we're going to be talking much more about that, but you see religion changing in a number of fundamental ways as these large stratified states start becoming more diverse, start becoming larger and more complex. Same way with philosophy. Just with people and having time to really kind of think and build upon learning and ideas over a protracted and prolonged period of time, people, of course, start coming up with new and inventive answers and solutions and ways to look at the world, and politics as well, because society is becoming more diverse, it's becoming more complex. The political landscape begins to change as well, and there's different and more variation in the kind of political settings that you're seeing, whether it comes in the form of the Greek democracy, the form of the empire, for example, of the Persians, or, for example, oligarchy, another kind of political method that was adopted and protracted with the Greeks as well. So all of these things are really key ways, I think, that you see civilization changing from the early civilizations that we talked about now into kind of the classical world where we left off at the end of our week, where you have very large cultural influences that are very, very diverse, that are operating on multiple levels, that have very strong religious and philosophical ideas, but oftentimes there are multiple of these within the same location, competing oftentimes with one another, and a wide variety of political forms that are trying to make sense and organize these new changes as well. Another really interesting thing to think about is all the exchanges and important time periods of contact that occurred within our classes this week. Many of the civilizations and cultures we have discussed were very reliant on trade and contact with other cultures. The ancient Near East, Greek, and Hellenistic worlds were very interconnected. I would like you to identify 3 cultural or economic exchanges that occurred during this time period. For each, you should identify the groups involved and what was being exchanged and how it has impacted the groups involved, etc. I didn't list all the good ideas that people had. Overall, everyone did a very good job with this question, but I just wanted to grab a few of the highlights to highlight these various periods. The first would be the Amarna period. If you remember, the Amarna period was really kind of almost like the first attempt at a kind of international diplomacy, so to speak. There were this complex system of relationships that became developed between the very powerful civilizations of the late Bronze Age. You had Egypt, for example, you had the Hittites, you had the Mitanni, you had the Babylonians, you had the Assyrians, and all of them were exchanging letters and notes to each other. They're exchanging gifts. Oftentimes they would be exchanging wives between, family members between them, trying to make these kind of formal bonds between the various kingdoms to try to essentially kind of create a diplomacy and a way to talk and resolve differences and create camaraderie without having to necessarily go to war, even though oftentimes these civilizations were, for the time period, separated by large distances and so forth. They were still very much interconnected. So it's really interesting to see during the Amarna period all the kind of diplomatic relationships that were formed and developed during this time period. And with that, oftentimes, like I said, came economy, came commerce, and came much stronger ties between all these various civilizations of the ancient Near East. The Minoans and the Phoenicians really sort of took the idea of trading and commerce and took it to a new level through the use of the sea and the oceans. The Phoenicians being along the coast and kind of some of those old Canaanite cities in the Levant area on the eastern coast of the Mediterranean. The Minoans, of course, being on the island of Crete. And they both became incredibly proficient seafarers, traded their goods, olive oil, dye, and so forth all over the Mediterranean to Egypt, to all these various Near Eastern kingdoms that we've been talking about. There's even evidence that the Phoenicians were able to go through the Red Sea down the coast of Africa, extensively trading in Africa, and that they even were able to round the Cape of Good Hope and circumnavigate all of Africa as well. So very proficient sailors, very proficient traders, and they were both able to form very strong civilizations based upon this kind of idea of commerce and trade that were going to have long-lasting impacts in the Mediterranean world. Greek colonization, kind of after the reformation of these kind of classical civilizations, after sort of their collapse, so to speak, or the kind of intermediate period, Greek colonization becomes a big part of this because the things getting better in Greece once again. The populations of these polis, or the cities, become very high. So they begin sending out colonies throughout the Mediterranean world. You have them going all over the Black Sea, for example, reaching into Central Asia, developing relationships and contact and trade with kind of the nomadic pastoral nomadic peoples of Central Asia. You have them going to the Italian peninsula, to Sicily, to North Africa, in some cases all the way over to Spain into the Atlantic. Very, very widespread, and that all these Greek colonies were in contact with one another oftentimes. They were trading with one another, and that they were really kind of turning the Mediterranean into an interstate of commerce, in the same way that the Phoenicians certainly did. And the Phoenicians were kind of operating at the same time as the Greeks. You know, the Phoenicians were a little bit more dedicated and a little bit more active in North Africa and the southern portions of the Mediterranean. The Greeks were a little bit more prevalent in the north, but there was plenty of crossover between these groups as well. The contact that came with the Persian Empire, I think, is another excellent example, where you have one empire that is now controlling several different peoples. Really, for this point in time in history, controlling the largest empire in the world, and able to take, for example, new crops, new ideas, new trading goods from as far away as India, mix them in with Anatolia or Turkey, mixing with Egypt, and that there's a great emphasis on the part of the Persians to kind of standardize the system, right? There's increased standardization of currency within the Persian Empire to help people in the various portions of the empire buy and sell these goods that they are now being able to trade. There's a great dedication to roads and improving the transportation systems within the empire to help people trade and bring these goods and products from one location to another. And that this really, once more, sort of turns this ancient Near East area into one of the most kind of vibrant trading centers in the world, which to one degree or another really maintains that status through the various reiterations of the Persian Empire, through the Hellenistic world, and moving forward, even until we will get to here in a couple of weeks, up to the arrival of Islam, and the Islamic kingdoms and empires that form this same location are oftentimes taking advantage of the same trade routes and the same kind of bases that the Persian Empire sets up at this time period. So very, very important, the precedent that the Persian Empire sets, particularly in the case of commerce and trade and uniting the various diverse portions of their empire together into kind of one economic system. The Athenians kind of tried to do the same thing in the Mediterranean in kind of their own sphere. For example, the creation of the Delos League, kind of this, think about it like an almost early trade federation, so to speak, where their Athens were, of course, incredibly open, incredibly dependent upon trade oftentimes for their survival and for their power and just kind of to maintain themselves, and that they really pushed the boundaries of this kind of idea of a lot of various smaller city-states and polises coming together to form a large trading league and trading union that eventually becomes an incredibly powerful economic force within the Mediterranean world as well. And finally, the Hellenistic world, right, where you have really the ancient Near East and the Greek worlds through the conquest of Alexander the Great becoming enmeshed together, and this sort of the same processes that we talked about under the Persian Empire are only pushed even farther. The biggest difference is that the Hellenistic world was never as united as the Persian Empire, right? Very quickly after the death of Alexander the Great, his empire splits into all these little small competing kingdoms, so you weren't able to have the same sort of overarching presence that the Persian Empire had. But at the same point in time, you're having kind of a common Greek culture, very similar kind of currencies and economic systems that are allowing people to go between these various kingdoms to trade with one another and to, for most of kind of the Eastern Mediterranean and Near Eastern world, interconnect them to a large degree. So these are just kind of some of the hot spots that you could have pointed at. But from this time period, it only is going to increase the importance of these kind of trading webs and trading networks that the various locations around the world are creating and thriving upon. And certainly the Mediterranean and the ancient Near East are two of the most important ones that we're going to see recurring throughout the remainder of our class, and even moving further into in the second portion if you want to come back for that as well. All right, moving on down here to Dear History. overall, everyone did a very good job in their letters to Cyrus the Great. I thought you posed some really good questions to Cyrus. A lot of people were very curious about kind of his kind of mythological background. Did you really have to flee because your father or your grandfather or relative was going to be killing you? How did you come back and kind of rise to power again? Was that all true? Was that just made up? How are you able to convince the army of the Medians to come over and join you on your side? And how were you able to kind of go through your conquest and accumulate such a large empire? And a lot of people are also very curious as to his decision, a lot of times, to try very, very hard to portray himself as not a conqueror, but as a liberator, as a just ruler, oftentimes, where even though he'd come in and he'd conquer people, he would oftentimes make common cause with the religious establishments, trying to portray himself as the sort of true caretaker of their religion. For example, in Babylon, he rebuilds all of the temples to Marduk and accuses the old king of sort of letting the religious ideology crumble and that he's going to restore that. Oftentimes, he doesn't really try to upset the status quo. In fact, a lot of times he tries to redress old wrongs. For example, when the Assyrians, one of their practices oftentimes to quench rebellion within their territory was to uproot entire populations and bring part of them to another part of their empire so that they wouldn't rebel against them. For example, the Jewish people. When Cyrus comes over and takes over Babylon, he sees that this practice is going on with the Babylonians, redresses that, sends the Jewish people back to Israel, and they are very, very grateful for this. He does it to other groups that have been displaced through similar processes by either the Babylonians or the Assyrians as well. Also, even the people he conquers and takes over, even the rulers, oftentimes he's very, very lenient to them. He doesn't kill them, he doesn't execute them. He tries to find some way to make use of them. If they were a king of one location, he'll send them to a different part of the empire to become a governor there, because obviously they have experience ruling, but they're going to be not so tied in with kind of the local politics that they're going to be able to ferment a rebellion against them very easily. So pretty much everything he can try to do to still show he's an incredibly strong and powerful ruler, but that doesn't necessarily mean having to be a cruel ruler, right? So a lot of people are really interested in the process and the mind thought of that. And I thought you also told Cyrus a lot of really cool things about the world today, about how interconnected it is, how Iran is kind of still basing itself upon the Persian Empire from so long ago, and how they're still a country today. I thought everyone did a very good job of answering our dear history questions here, and I'm sure Cyrus would be very interested to read through and answer those, and I'd love to know the answers of them along with all of you. All right, moving down to number 4. So we're just going to start looking a little bit more about how religion and philosophy begins to change during this time period. And so first of all, I want you to compare the religious and philosophical ideas of Zoroastrianism, Judaism, and Greek philosophy, and then explain how these religions were different from traditional religions of Mesopotamia, Egypt, and traditional Greek mythology. And one of the first aspects that everyone pointed out was the idea of the development of monotheism, right? The idea that as going from a polytheistic set of beliefs and religions of, for example, the Mesopotamians or the Egyptians, where there are all sorts of different various anthropomorphic gods who were oftentimes kind of tied to natural forces. You are now having increasingly just kind of an idea of one overarching, overpowerful god. You have that with the Zoroastrianisms in Ahura Mazda. You have that with the Jewish religion in the form of Yahweh, and you even have a complete questioning of kind of the legitimacy of religion, or the explanation through religion in Greek philosophy, right? Also, another thing you see very much in terms of this is this idea of divine conflict, where there had always been a sense, usually within these mythologies, that there was conflict between the gods. You can think of the example of the creation story from Mesopotamia, of the war that entailed. You can think about the conflict between the brothers in Egyptian mythology. There's oftentimes conflict between the gods. What ends up happening, though, with these later religions is that people and human beings get entered into that idea of a divine conflict. And now it's not just conflicts between the gods. Uh, People are at the center of it. It's gods who are competing for people to oftentimes do the right thing or act in a certain way, and that people are playing a more centralized role to the mythologies that are being created. And that's really the transition that you see. The transition between simply trying to appease the gods and the transition towards regulating human society. In a lot of ways, the emphasis is taken off the idea of gods and is much more placed on the idea of humanity and human society through this idea of monotheism. Essentially, they're just taking kind of all the things that the gods used to do and either grouping them into one deity or entirely trying to find explanations around that deity in the form of Greek philosophy. So it's in a lot of ways kind of simplifying and standardizing the mythological beliefs that had come before it. But you also, and this is the most important aspect, see a much greater emphasis on regulating, controlling, and forming the increasing complexity of human societies. And I think that's really the driving force of it. And it's interesting because you see the same process happening around the world at this point in time. You see it happening in China with the development of Taoism and Confucianism. You see it happening in India with the creation of new religions such as Buddhism or Jainism. And it seems like around the world, as civilizations are becoming more complex and social dynamics are becoming more important, the focus is becoming more and more upon how are people supposed to relate to one another? How are they supposed to relate to the growing complexity of human society? Not how are they supposed to relate to the environment. Not how are they supposed to relate to a specific god. That's really, I think, the transition that we're seeing here. This age or time period we're talking about is known as the Axial Age, and like I said, it takes place in a large number of locations around the same time. There could have been, and there was oftentimes, you can see evidence of this, contact between these various groups, but I think it's something more than that. I think a lot of the changes that we talked about up here in the transition from the ancient civilizations to the classical civilizations, you can see it reflected here, where there's, like I said, the simplification of the gods, the fact that humans are now kind of present in the center of this divine conflict, means that it's going to be up to people who are either doing the right thing or the wrong thing where they're going to come down on the side of this conflict, right? And that oftentimes this becomes the emphasis of these new religions. They begin asking new questions, not simply, where does the weather come from? Where do floods come from? How do we get our crops to grow well? No, now they're thinking about questions like, what does it mean to be a just or moral person? What is a person's obligation to their community versus an obligation to their family? What does it take to be a good person and be a good person within a larger community? These are oftentimes what the new philosophical and religious ideas from this time period begin to try to tackle. And I think you can really kind of see a stepped progression here in religion as the complexity of civilizations increases. For example, we talked very early on about how ancestor worship had been kind of the primary religion of the Paleolithic era, right? Before the invention of agriculture, and even in a lot of those very early agricultural villages, a lot of people still had this very close personal tie to their own ancestors or the ancestors of people who were close to them within a group or a village. And if you think about it, this makes a lot of sense. That was obviously people were very, very close to their families. When there wasn't these kind of larger stratified state systems, a lot of times that's what you had. That was what was very important to you when you're living in a group of 30 or 40 hunter and gatherers. All you have is each other, which is not surprising then that you have that same connection to the people and generations who came before you. Increasingly, though, as the size of populations increases, ancestor worship becomes a lot harder because while you can still worship and make common cause with your own ancestors, it becomes much more difficult to identify with those same beliefs of your neighbors and other peoples within the town or the city, because the ancestors and the great grandfather or a relation of someone you just met is not going to have the same meaning to you. So, in a cause for common meaning, as well as a cause and an emphasis to explain the new importance of the natural surroundings with the advent of agriculture, you start having this transition towards these more anthropomorphic nature gods, right? You have the gods of thunder, you have the gods of fresh water and rains, the gods of floods. The entire idea of kind of making the Nile River out to sort of be a deity and a god all fits very neatly into this because this is now the kind of central focus of most people within a society. They need to make sure that through agriculture they're able to get enough food to provide for themselves and for their family, but at the same point in time have a similar kind of ideology with the other people within a larger village, a larger town, or a city. So it makes sense that the gods start to kind of reflect the human society. You can see the gods going from kind of a communal god pantheon to one based around kind of a kingship model when that becomes more common in these early civilizations. But now as time goes on, you start seeing as more and more people are able to kind of have that occupational separation. They're able to survive without having to depend on agriculture. As agriculture in general becomes kind of more standardized and stable with these kind of classical civilizations, the focus then shifts once again to the, like I said, increasing social complexity of the world that people are now living in, and that becomes their primary concern. No longer the personal connection to their ancestors, no longer the kind of communal connection to the natural environment through the gods. It becomes surviving in a very large, complex, stratified state system and how best to do that. And almost all of these axial age religions that come about at this point in time, that becomes the central theme, trying to maintain order and create kind of a common bond with others around you within the same kind of social setting. And they do it in very, very different ways, but ultimately that ends up being the goal, whether you think about Buddhism, whether you think about Confucianism, whether you think about Judaism, or eventually Christianity or Islam, which spawn off of that. Oftentimes they really have kind of the same basic functioning goals of trying to create order within a complex society. All right, moving on to one of the kind of more interesting aspects of the class, and one that really kind of, I think, depicts both the commonality of Greek culture, but also very much how different these individual polises were. Remember, the polis was kind of the most kind of key element of Greek culture, right? The city, and that formed everyone's pretty much primary allegiance. We have this idea of kind of an interconnected Greek world today, but at the time, all these city-states were very, very independent from one another. And even though there were these kind of cultural elements that bound them together to a certain degree, as you can see with Athens and Sparta, they were very, very different places. So let's dig into this and how some people saw some aspects of these cultures as positive, some of them as negatives, some you could probably see in both lights and in both ways. So the most important thing, we'll start with Sparta. The most important thing to remember about Sparta, and the one thing that leads to all of the social engineering, all of the warrior culture, all of that stems from one key aspect. And some people brought this up, but I don't think quite enough of you did, because you really can't understate this importance to Sparta. Sparta was the largest slave-owning population in Greece. They had tons and tons of enslaved populations, the Helots, underneath them, that they pretty much forced to do all the agricultural work for them so that they did not have to. The problem was that the Helots, of course, did not like being slaves and not want to be slaves, and rebelled oftentimes against the Spartans, and there were actually a lot more Helots than there were Spartans. So all of Spartan culture and society, the great sort of warrior society that they create for themselves, is also that they can maintain control over their slave population. And that is the driving force behind all of this that occurs. And if you think about it in that way, even though there does end up being this kind of egalitarian society that the Spartans are able to build, you have to remember that it's an egalitarian society only among the Spartans themselves, and that it's an entire society built upon inequality and keeping an entire different cultural group of people enslaved underneath you. So as I said, this leads to an incredibly large degree, and one of the most pronounced, I would say, examples of social engineering that we see within history, where, like the document stated, from even before someone's born, from the entire idea of conception, you know, they're thinking about trying to breed strong, able warriors. That women are expected to stay in very good physical condition so that they can have strong sons. A lot of people, for the negatives, brought up the idea of infanticide, that anyone or any baby that was born that did not sort of exude the Spartan strength, or had a birth defect or something like that that they made think might not make an ideal warrior, would oftentimes be killed and left out to die. We talked, and I think the videos throughout the weeks here also mentioned this, how high the infant mortality rate already was within the ancient world. And taken on top of that, then, this kind of practice of taking anything that seems unideal and killing them, that the Spartans did, it's not a surprise that eventually they run into some pretty serious population issues and are having a very tough time maintaining their society. But it shows you how dedicated they were to this very strict ideal of perfection. The fact that children were taken away from their families at a very young age, essentially raised in communal barracks with others of their age. Oftentimes, this kind of training they underwent was incredibly brutal, incredibly harsh. The children were very harshly punished. Sometimes they were starved, left out in the elements, and that you get the sense that really only the very, very fit and brutal of them were the ones who survived and made it through this process. So that you know, at the one side, you do have the idea of there was a lot of equality within the civilization of, at least between the Spartans, because they were all exactly the same. They were all raised the same way. They all had the same expectations. There really wasn't, remember we talked about last week how the idea of wealth was such an important dividing factor within social stratification. That idea of wealth has really, for the most part, been stamped out of Spartan society, right? There's not a lot of trade with outside people. That's very much looked down upon and frowned upon. There's not a lot of commerce going on within Sparta itself. That also is kind of, you know, looked down upon and frowned upon. So that, you know, that there really isn't a whole lot of separation of wealth. It is much more of a meritocracy than you do see in a lot of other places in the ancient world. But it is so rigid and so strictly controlled that for anyone who doesn't kind of fit into that ideal model of what a Spartan should be, is either going to be killed or ostracized or have a very hard time living within this society. One of the very interesting things that's kind of paradoxical, and that a lot of people also brought up, was the role of women. How women actually did have a much higher status within Spartan society than they had in Athens, than they had in a lot of other locations around the ancient world. It was a kind of interesting role, even though they were very much respected and so forth. Which I don't think you should undermine. A lot of times they were just kind of left alone for the most part, because the men were kept so isolated and so separated from them that it's almost like you had two states going on. You had the women on one hand and the young children and older men, and then you had kind of the barracks military life and the, you know, group of people between the ages of 6 and 30 that were pretty much in operation there. And even after the age of 30, they were oftentimes, even if they were free from or past kind of the age where they were kind of supposed to be, and that they still weren't. They still spend most of their time with their old companions and in the barracks and so forth. And I think the document, or the video, I should say, did a really interesting job explaining how the idea of homosexuality fit into all that. How oftentimes Spartan men were very much encouraged to form these kind of romantic relationships between one another, because they really felt that it made for better soldiers. That if you were in love with the person you were standing next to fighting in battle, you wouldn't turn around and run or retreat, or you do everything in your power to help fight and protect them. Even to the degree where Spartan women were dressed up like men on their wedding night in order to kind of consummate their marriages. Really shows you the degree to which Spartan society was very, very unique within the ancient world. And the degree to which the social engineering had pretty much derived their population to a single specific focus, which on one hand, I think you do have to commend it just for how committed they were to that ideal. They were very, very isolationist. If anyone from another city-state wanted to come in, they couldn't just go around freely. They'd kind of have to have Spartan guards to go around with them. They couldn't just come in to like tour. They'd have to be there kind of on official business, so to speak. And I think another advantage people oftentimes point to is their military record, how they did perform very well oftentimes in military engagements. Often a lot of people pointed to the idea of Thermopylae standing up against the Persian Empire with a very small amount of Spartans able to take on an incredibly large Persian force. So that you do kind of see the proof of the effectiveness to a certain degree. But at the same point in time, and as time goes on, you start seeing a lot of the flaws of Sparta becoming apparent. And this is really the result of this social engineering. First of all, like I said, they run into some really tough population issues with the fact that there are low birth rates because, women and men, first of all, are kept very, very separate. So the time period for actually making babies is much less available than in other city-states. The fact that there was that infanticide going on, and that even to, like I said, just make it through life as a Spartan sounds incredibly difficult, and I'm sure there are plenty of people along the way who just didn't make it. Also, you really see a problem come about in the idea of craftsmanship within Sparta. The fact that because no one was kind of allowed or had any emphasis to try to improve upon kind of the what's the word I'm looking for? Not even artistic, but even just kind of functional side of making things. You see a great decrease in the quality, for example, of their pottery. It's like they even forget how to make or don't take the time to make good pottery, repair their arms and their weapons and their armor. That technology and that skill level seems to go down throughout time and throughout the time period, so that Spartan society ends up running into some really severe problems later on, which is really one of the reasons why after the Peloponnesian War, they're not really players on a regional or world stage any longer after that time period, because in a lot of ways the society that they set up just simply wasn't sustainable over a long period of time. But there is this legacy that they leave behind of just kind of how successful a culture can be when they are so devoted to kind of social engineering that the Spartans had committed to here, and commit they did. So let's take a look at Athens. And one of the first key points that people pointed out with Athens was the fact that they developed a form of democracy where large portions of the population, or at least certain portions of the population, would have a chance to decide the political future of the city-state, how they had kind of kicked out the tyrants, kicked out the kings, so to speak, or people trying to become sort of dictators, and that they were very, very cautious to make sure that these kind of dictators would not rise up again from within Athenian society to take back over again, that they really kind of valued their political freedom to that degree. But it was only the people who were kind of considered citizens that valued this, right? Not everyone was a citizen. There were only a certain kind of class of people fit this bill. Oftentimes they had to be kind of landowning or property owning men. Women were completely excluded from this political process, and there were also large people who either were in debt or were poor or underclass who would not be included within this decision-making process as well. So it was a small percentage of the population who could actually participate in this. But comparatively, it was a lot higher percentage than you had in most other governmental forms in the ancient world. But there was a relatively high level of social stratification within Athens, where people could become enslaved for having high debts, or there were slaves within Athens as well, who were used for either domestic servitude or even as tutors sometimes. For sexual work. There were slaves within Athens as well as the Helots within Sparta, but the Athenians did not have nearly as many slaves as the Spartans did, and hence did not seem to have the same emphasis on having to make sure that they sort of redesigned their entire civilization in order to combat the threat of a slave uprising. There was never that same concern within Athens. That being said, there was still a lot of inequality going on within Athens, despite the increased equality between some members of the population. The role of women was also in Athens much more in line with kind of the patriarchal systems that we have talked about up until this point in time. Women were very much kind of excluded from the political realm. There was more inclusion for women in the religious realm, oftentimes, as kind of religious ceremonies and festivals and things like that. Women could play functions within the religious realm, where in other patriarchal societies, oftentimes they're excluded from those as well. But certainly from kind of the political realm and having many occupations outside of just kind of being a homeowner or a homekeeper were not available to women within Athenian society. As they might have been within Spartan society, for example, as women were essentially in charge of running things while the men were playing soldier, not put too fine a point on it. Athens, of course, was also incredibly invested in trade and commerce, that they were one of the kind of brightest trading hubs of the Greek world. They relied upon that. It really formed part of the Athenian identity. And, of course, that was in stark contrast to the isolationism of Sparta. And that meant that Athens was kind of a very open society, right? Where there was a lot of influence coming in from outside groups, outside people, outside cultures. And you can see kind of pros and cons with that as well. I mean, one of the cons of kind of Athens' more kind of worldly openness was they spark a war with the Persian Empire by kind of getting involved with Persian politics. And a Persian army comes to essentially squash Athens, which they're able to defeat at the Battle of Marathon, but eventually the Persians come back for revenge. A few years later, which kind of sparks the Second Persian War. But the fact that Athens, Sparta never would have sparked that kind of conflict with the Persians, because they wouldn't have been out messing in any kind of Persian business, whereas the Athens were a little bit more open to or susceptible to that. But at the same point in time, I don't think it's a surprise that there's this openness that corresponds to the strong role that philosophy plays within Athens, and how Athens kind of becomes an intellectual center of the Greek world and eventually of the ancient world, because there were this kind of exchange of ideas, and there was kind of this openness to Athenian thought and Athenian society that you didn't see other places, and that you certainly did not see within Sparta. Moving on to number 6, list it. So we've now covered 3 main periods of Greek philosophy: the Ionic pre-Socratics, for example, Pythagoras and Democritus; classical, Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle; and Hellenistic, Epicurus, Zeno, and Diogenes. And I'd like you to list the most important ideas and contributions for each philosopher. These do not need to be full sentences, but enough to portray a basic concepts of their philosophies. And once more, as long as you gave me a good sense that you understood the individual, understood their philosophies, and that most importantly you used our class materials in order to answer those questions, I pretty much gave you credit for these. So for Pythagoras and Democritus, you really have an idea of trying to find explanation within the natural world for one of the first times, right? Trying to look for explanation and causation outside of the divine, outside of the idea of gods. And that they end up coming up with some very important ideas. Of course, Pythagoras coming up with the idea of ratios and his contributions to music, the idea of pi, his mathematical contributions. Democritus, of course, coming up with the idea of atoms, right? The idea that the world is actually comprised of little tiny particles that are all fit together, and that creates everything. Very, very similar to our modern understanding of kind of quantum physics, and it's incredible that someone 2,500 years ago, was able to come up with these same ideas, and didn't have all the answers and didn't have it completely right, but damn close. So yeah, the fact that they were able to look at the world around them and make some very accurate depictions and calculations is pretty incredible. Once you get onto the idea of the classical society, I think the Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle really shows you the idea that we talked about earlier of the axial age thought, and how their main goal was the idea of people within society and how should people act. Of course, it wasn't limited to that. Aristotle does a lot of kind of the natural philosophy as well, trying to use rationality and reason to depict the world around them. But he also is very involved and interested in politics as well, right? Socrates, of course, the idea of just kind of questioning everything and posing tough questions to people in power, people of authority, people who think they're smart, and really just kind of asking, why are things the way they are? Why are we doing things a certain way? Of course, he makes lots of enemies in doing this, which leads to, I guess, I should have mentioned this up in one of the downsides of Athens, this idea of democracy, that you can kind of get this mob rule within Athens, right? Where if you tick enough people off, they'll can come and get you, and there's not a lot of protection against that. Of course, in the case of Socrates, that's what happens. He sufficiently kind of pisses off enough people where they get together and accuse him of kind of corrupting the youth of Athens against the gods and sentence him to death. So kind of his questioning and philosophical ideas are so powerful that they actually lead to his demise in the end. Plato and Aristotle have a much easier time of it. They are both more or less embraced by Athens and Greek culture, but they're very much in tuned and committed as well to try to figure out what's the best political system for people to have. What's the best way to regulate and organize society? Plato, of course, comes to the conclusion that it's this the kind of smartest, brightest, kind of the geniuses of the world should be the ones who run everything. That there should kind of be this small group, kind of like an oligarchy. The small group of the wisest people should be the ones who sit around, rationally think about every problem and come up with the best solution, and all the rest of the people in society should just kind of rally around and say, how can we serve, what can we do to make things better for ourselves? That was kind of Plato's idea. Aristotle had very different ideas. He thought that kind of the best politicians were people who might not be kind of too rich on the very top of society, maybe not people who are super poor at the bottom of society, but people who are kind of in the middle, kind of people with moderate ideas had the best role and the best place and made the best decisions. So a lot of discussion between these various philosophers. There's plenty about the natural world. There's plenty about kind of the sometimes very metaphysical with Plato, kind of thought, reality. What is reality? That enters into it as well. But certainly a strong focus on the role that government plays and that people play, and it's not a great surprise that these ideas were being formed in Athens, where kind of that sort of political experiment of democracy was happening. And I think the emphasis on axial age religions actually comes even more clearly through with the later philosophers in the Hellenistic world, with Epicurus, with Zeno and Diogenes. And part of this is because after there's contact with India, in the Hellenistic world, you start seeing some of those ideas coming into Epicureanism, coming into Stoicism, and to a certain degree coming into cynicism as well, so that you can see kind of a direct physical influence of these kind of Eastern Indian philosophies influencing the new kind of generation of philosophers within Greece. Epicurus really is kind of taking the worldview that Democritus set up, that the world is sort of made up of these atoms, these small particles, and takes it a step further and comes up with the idea that that means that everything is temporary, that the world, the universe, is constantly in flux because these little tiny particles can be broken down and can be reassembled over and over and over again in an infinite amount of ways, so nothing is ever going to stay the same forever. That leads Epicurus to really emphasizing the importance of the now, right? That he doesn't look ahead. He doesn't think there's an afterlife. He thinks that when you are dead, you just decay, and that the matter that makes up you is going to enter back into the universe and be reformed into something else. So his main emphasis then is to strive for as most pleasure for yourself and those around you as you can during your lifetime. That should be people's focus, and that should be people's emphasis. And later people have tried to sort of take this idea and take it out of context and say that this meant that Epicurus was promoting just kind of running wild and doing whatever you wanted and eating as much as you wanted and having sex with whoever you wanted and being very lustful. And this was very, very much not what Epicurus was trying to stand for. Epicurus really thought that the main way to be happy was through moderation, was not to overindulge yourself, because that actually led to not being happy. That if you ate way too much, you would not feel well, you would not be happy, it would lead to health complications, so that is not essentially pursuing pleasure. That's actually doing the opposite. Same thing. If you're just going to, be subject to your every lust and your every kind of sexual whim, that in the long run, that doesn't lead to happiness. That a much more kind of moderate sexual appetite is what's actually going to kind of lead people towards ultimate pleasure. So that is really kind of Epicurus's focus, trying to make sure that people are receiving as much pleasure within their life as they can, and a big part of that is sort of insulating themselves from the whims of chance and the whims of fate. Not to the same degree as the Cynics and Diogenes, but that also plays a part of it as well, that for the Epicureans, and all these Hellenistic philosophers are very, very much influenced, and we're talking about this in our 5 things down here, by the fact that there's now the separation. There's now the separation between the polis and the people and the ruling establishment. How after, in the Hellenistic world, after the death of Alexander the Great, that the power gets stripped away from the city-states, and it's now in the hands of these larger kings, whether it's the Ptolemaics or whether it's the other kind of Hellenistic kingdoms, that the city-states no longer have the power or the authority, which was kind of so central to the identity of the Greek polises and their philosophers, such as Aristotle, Plato, and Socrates. So Epicurus, Zeno, and Diogenes are oftentimes trying to explain how to achieve happiness and contentment and peace in a world that is separated from kind of the traditional way that people interacted with in their societies. And Epicurus is certainly a part of that as well, saying that by focusing more upon your own pleasure and the pleasure of those around you and not upon the kind of wider problems in the world, kind of removing yourself from the wider problems of the world, is the only way that you can achieve happiness, and that is the greatest good that you can achieve. Zeno takes it in a slightly different direction. He doesn't think that you should completely remove yourself and only focus in the idea of Stoicism on your own pleasure, but that, once more, you should kind of try to make that idea of moderation, finding your place in the world and not trying to fight against fate as being the most important elements. That bad things are going to happen, and all you have to do is just bear with them. And it's really interesting because this idea of Stoicism matches up and is very, very similar to Hindu ideas of karma and of dharma, and of kind of finding peace within one's place that they are assigned within the universe. Stoicism is very, very similar, and I think you can really see clear influences between the Hindu presence within the Hellenistic world and the philosophy of the Stoics, because they are so similar, and they're developed at a time shortly after those two cultures came into prolonged contact with one another. So with the Stoics, once more, they are similar to Epicureanism, very concerned with moderation, with kind of taking the middle path, but also doing it uncomplainingly, not worrying about the whims of fate, and simply trying to do the best one can within their position, within their station, and trying to generally make society a better place for everyone involved. Diogenes and the Cynics would say that's a bunch of BS. Diogenes, his biggest ideas were essentially any kind of hierarchy or social structure is meaningless, and you should try to remove yourself from that as much as possible. So you should not participate in politics. You should not participate in kind of your city at all. In fact, he was kind of one of those who gave up everything. The idea essentially being that if you didn't have anything that you were attached to, you really couldn't lose anything, and that was the best way to achieve happiness within kind of this new hectic world that the Greeks found themselves in, was trying to completely cut yourself off from ties of nationality, of family, of loyalty to anyone, and just to get by yourself as simply as possible, to the point where he even didn't want to use a bowl, or felt guilty he was using a bowl because he thought that was too lavish. He had too much attachment to it, so he had to destroy his own bowl. Very sort of I'm looking for, kind of very extreme, you would say, philosophy here, but actually it seems very, very similar, actually, I would say, to Jainist ideas, another Indian religion that developed slightly before this time period, where the Jains were also very devoted to giving up all worldly possessions, not harming everything else in the world, to the degree where some of its members would even starve to death for refusing to eat. So another very extreme kind of philosophical idea that I think you can see elements of coming into the Greek world and the Hellenistic world here. So that is my rundown of these Greek philosophers. A lot of you did a very good job as well. On to number 7, what would you do? I'm going to kind of go quickly through this because I thought for the most part everyone gave Alexander the Great some really good feedback here and some really good possible solutions. A lot of you took kind of a variation of something he already did, saying you have to find a way to integrate Persian culture and the culture of the Egyptians and these various cultures within your empire. You should try to find a way to divide the empire up. And a lot of people did an excellent job saying what he should do is take the example of Cyrus the Great and his conquests and do something very, very similar because of how Cyrus was able to construct such a large, long-lasting civilization by essentially setting himself up as a liberator and a protector of traditions, not as a force of destruction or of change. For example, a lot of people said that maybe he should maintain the Persian satrapy government system because that had worked so well for the Persian Empire, running and regulating a multicultural empire. Why shouldn't it work for the Greeks as well? Of course, what Alexander actually does is something very close to that. It seems like he, towards the end of his life, is trying very, very hard to incorporate the traditional Persian ruling system and government system into his empire. He, of course, takes a Persian wife. He is encouraging his officers and his generals to take Persian wives as well. It's like he's trying to create a new royalty or a new aristocracy. and that he begins taking on a lot of the trappings of the Persian Empire and the Persian kings. And this really makes a lot of kind of his Macedonian generals very, very nervous, that they see that he is actively kind of, wearing the clothes of the enemy, or performing the ceremonies of the enemy. And so you can see Alexander did, I think, have this kind of long game image in mind of really combining the Persian Empire with the Macedonian and Greek world. But of course, unfortunately, he dies before this is ever able to be accomplished. And the end result is that the Greek Empire and the Persian Empire are just broken down between his various generals into smaller, competing, warring kingdoms. Okay, moving down to number 8, 5 things. What were the 5 most important differences you noticed between classical Hellenistic Greece, Greece before Alexander the Great, and Hellenistic Greece, the Near East, after the death of Alexander the Great? Once more, I'm not going to list all the responses I got from people, because a lot of people had very good responses, but I just want to hit some of the high notes I want to make sure everyone is aware of. So first and most important is the idea of the centrality of the polis, or the city, within traditional Greek culture. Even if you think about traditional Greek religion was always based upon the relationship between the city to the gods. The gods each had their own individual city. For example, Athena in Athens. A lot of the Greek religious traditions and festivals were based upon specific cities and specific city-states, so that when you bring Greek culture out into the wider Near Eastern world, that doesn't translate because the locations aren't the same. And also, of course, after the fall of Alexander the Great, after his death, his empire is divided up, and now the polises are no longer independent city-states. They're now under some form of rule, some form of kingship is being lorded over them. So they no longer have this self-government element to them, which was so central to the traditional classical Greek identity. And those are 2 of the biggest changes that you see happening. And of course, just simply geography as well. The fact that now Hellenistic Greece incorporates not just Greece, but Macedonia, portions of Central Asia around the Black Sea. You have all the locations of the Persian Empire, so you have Turkey, you have Mesopotamia, all the way to India, including Bactria. You have Egypt. All of these are now being influenced by Greek culture and are kind of part of the Hellenistic world. So the geography becomes incredibly different between kind of the Hellenistic world and the Greek world, and that changes things for Hellenistic Greece itself, because now it's not just culture within your own small region; it's spread throughout the entire region. This, of course, has impacts on religion too. The book, I think, did a really good job showing how these fusion religions start springing up, because there was a separation between traditional Greek mythology and the polis, and now where Greeks are living throughout the entire Near East. It's not surprisingly that they're taking local traditions and local religions and mixing them and fusing them with Greek religion. Same thing with philosophy. I already talked about excuse me. I already talked about the importance of ideas from India in Greek philosophy, and that's not the only example. There's plenty of other examples of ideas coming from India, ideas coming from the Persians, that are influencing other thinking at this point in time, and innovation as well. How a lot of these kings in the Hellenistic world were very much devoted to accumulating knowledge, to supporting scholars, to supporting inventors. So you do have all this innovation in science, in medicine, in engineering, in philosophy, all happening in the Hellenistic world. Not to say that there wasn't this going on in the classical Greece, Hellenic world, but that the Hellenistic world, you see just an even greater kind of flourishing of that. All right, going on down to Quote Me. This week we learned about several rulers, politicians, scientists, and philosophers. I'd like you to use the link to Brainy Quote, which I supplied there, to compile 10 quotes from at least 5 individuals listed below. Type the name of the individual into the search bar to find the quote. Why did you choose 10 quotes that you felt best encapsulates these individuals, their ideas, and their ideologies? Then explain why you chose each quote and how it is representative of the historical figure. So, to save on time, I just kind of selected one quote that I thought was pretty representative of the historical figure that I saw someone use throughout or during in your answers here. There are lots of other ones besides the ones I've listed here that you could have chosen, and that people did an excellent job of explaining how the quotes sort of encapsulate the essence of the individual who made them. But I'll just go through this real quick. With Pythagoras, there is geometry in the humming of the strings. There is music in the spacing of spheres. Pythagoras, of course, very influential in taking these kind of mathematical principles of ratios and showing how music can be broken down essentially mathematically, and how important that was. And this quote, I think, does an excellent job of that. Herodotus, the father of history, one of the first people kind of what we think of as a historian today, who wrote extensively on the Persian and the Greek wars. His quote is, "If someone were to put a proposition before men, bidding them choose, after examination, the best customs in the world, each nation would certainly select its own." And this is really interesting because it shows, as a historian, Herodotus has a very early idea of bias. That he realizes that everyone is going to think that the customs that they come from are going to be the most natural, and that they're going to think is the best, and that they're going to be selecting their own. As a historian, of course, this is something you need to be really aware of. And one of the key things that Herodotus did was, in a writing of the Greek and the Persian wars, he didn't just take the Greek perspective on it. He actually did meticulous research in the form of interviews, oftentimes, with people in Persia and in part of the Persian world, to try to get their side of it and to try to get their history, and realize that if you only presented one side of an issue, you would be presenting an incomplete account of the events. So I think this quote really shows his understanding of that, and one of the key understandings that historians have to use even to this day. Let's drop down to Thucydides, who is another one of our very early historians. He says, wars spring from unseen and generally insignificant causes, the first outbreak being often but an explosion of anger. And Thucydides was writing during a different war, during the Peloponnesian War. And I think you can see this quote here really referring to that conflict, to the kind of very long, ambiguous, drawn-out conflict between Athens and Sparta, where there wasn't kind of a real clear reason why it began or why it started, and how it just kind of became this long-standing conflict between the two sides. But I think it's interesting if you think about what he's saying here just in relation to human nature, how, and if you look back at history, there really are a lot of wars that are seen from unseen and generally insignificant causes that ultimately lead to the outbreak, often from one kind of instituting explosion of anger, or one instituting event that kind of sparks these what seemed like unseen or insignificant causes, now comes to the head, boils over, and spreads into a war. So I think a pretty interesting perspective he has here. Going on down to some of our philosophers now, Plato says one of the penalties for refusing to participate in politics is that you end up being governed by your inferiors. So not only is this an endorsement to get out and vote here in a few months, but also the idea that Plato had that I get this very well within his philosophy of how the kind of wisest and brightest amongst a population or a civilization should be the ones who come to the forefront and take over the positions of ruling it. Remember, he had the idea of kind of an oligarchy of kind of wise sages running everything. And this, I think, fits very well into that these people who are wise and should be the ones who are participating in politics so that they are not being governed by those who are less than them. Of course, this is a very, what's the word I'm looking for? Elitist kind of philosophy that Plato is coming up with their idea, and the idea that what is superior or inferior is so easily identifiable certainly never pans out like that. And as far as I know, there was never a Greek city-state that actually kind of set itself up to follow Plato. Sparta had an oligarchy, but it certainly was not the oligarchy that Plato was envisioning here, of kind of sage-like intellectual rulers. Aristotle, a lot of people use this quote, and I think this is a very good one. The roots of education are bitter, and the fruit is sweet. And a lot of people pointed out that they can really relate to this being in the middle of education, and saying that even though we're going through the trials and the tribulations and having to answer all these darned questions now, in the future, though, it's going to be all worth it, because we're going to be able to achieve our goals, our dreams, get a good job, a good career, be a smart, informed person and participant in society, and that all of the roots of education are worth it. So I hope you do feel that way. But Aristotle certainly is pointing that out very early on, that he realizes that education and the learning process can be tedious, but that in Aristotle's opinion it is very much worth it. Pericles, one of course the authors of our document exercises for this, one of the rulers of Athens during the Peloponnesian War, says, freedom is the sure possession of those alone who have the courage to defend it. And of course, this fits very well within and from that document, or as a part of that document that we read, Pericles' idea of Athens as kind of defending its freedom, right? Its idea of democracy, its idea of people having more choice and more option than obviously their counterparts on the side of the Spartans, who were, of course, had very little choice oftentimes within their society. Of course, this can be overstated as well, because we do know, of course, that Athens, there was lots of inequality in there, and that the freedom did not apply equally to everyone within Athens. So you do have to take it with a grain of salt. But it makes lots of sense for Pericles to be saying this in the middle of the Peloponnesian War, because he's certainly framing what he envisions Athens to be fighting for here. Another one that I saw a lot of people using was this quote from Alexander the Great, which I think is another very telling quote about him. I am not afraid of an army of lions led by sheep. I am afraid of an army of sheep led by a lion. And I think this quote kind of operates on two levels. First of all, it shows that he has a great understanding of no matter how good or strong an army is, if the person or the individuals who are leading that army are not competent or not brave enough, or if they're not lions as he typifies them, they are not going to be successful, and that he'd much rather have an army of perhaps less ambitious or less that's what I'm looking for here. Because I'm not sure if this is the way Alexander the Great is using it, but this is the way it could be used, is having an army of people who are more devoted to being loyal than trying to lead themselves, as in the form of sheep, as opposed to an army of lions, of everyone trying to do their own thing at the same point in time. And to a certain degree, you can still kind of see the military ideology of that follows up to our current day, where the idea is that in an army, everyone sort of has a place and a role and a job that they are supposed to be fulfilled, that there is a command structure, and that an army is only going to work if people respect that command structure, and that you're not going to have an army of 10,000 people all trying to do 10,000 different things. But at the same point in time, on the top of that army, you need someone who can see the whole picture and effectively lead an army in that sense. And I think that's really the sense that Alexander the Great is trying to get across here. Archimedes, give me a lever long enough and a fulcrum on which to place it, and I shall move the world. I don't think there's any better quote here that can sum up Archimedes and his achievements. The fact that he really realized that through engineering, he could manipulate the world in a number of manner of ways, and that, I think it also fits very well into this idea of the pre-Socratics, of Aristotle, of the world being a physical, natural thing that people have control over. And Archimedes really saw that. And I think that this quote of his is a way to express the power that people are now having over their environment and over the idea of a natural surroundings around them. So a very good quote here for Archimedes. And finally, our Epicurus, the creator of Epicureanism, says, not what we have, but what we enjoy constitutes abundance. And I think this really fits into the distinction I was making earlier about Epicureanism, how it's not, pleasure isn't about accumulating enough wealth or accumulating a whole bunch of wealth or accumulating all these things that you think that you want. It's about enjoying the things that you have, is essentially what he's saying. It's not about what you can get, but it's about kind of enjoying, the what you already have. And that is where real happiness comes from. And that if you're only out there worrying about trying to get more, trying to make more money, trying to become more wealthy, you're really not going to be happy. And I think that Epicurus does a great job of really explaining, describing his ideas, and that future people really misunderstood that idea of that in seeking pleasure, there's a lot of things that people think would be pleasurable but are not if you overindulge them or worry too much about them. And Epicurus is very clear in pointing that out. Finally, we have Lights, Camera, and Action. Once more, I'm not going to stick too much on this, besides saying I would love to watch all your movies. A lot of you came up with some really excellent ideas. I just want to caution everyone to be careful when you are writing something like this. Make sure that you are still putting as much historical information and contextual information in there as possible to let me know that you are still reading and understanding and using the course material to answer the question. You still need to be using the course material to answer the question while still adding in these creative elements. So a few people got into a little bit of trouble in that respect by not providing enough, for example, historical contextual information on what they would do with the story or with the setting. So make sure you're being careful with that. But overall, I thought people did a really good job. A lot of really, really cool ideas. A lot of people wanting movies about Alexander the Great, about Cyrus the Great, about romances, about tragedies. Lots and lots of great ideas here. So thank you all for your creativity in this. All right, I know we're going long here, but we're going to wrap it up by real quickly going into our document exercise. Once more, if you're losing points on the document exercises, a lot of times it's because you're not putting in enough specific examples. Once more, I'm going to be going through here providing you tons and tons of examples of that you could have used. These aren't the only ones, by the way. These are just some of the key ones that I wanted to pick out to share with everyone to make sure we're all on the same page. But you could go through these documents and pick out a ton, and some of these could even apply to multiple questions. It's all how you want to use them, but as long as you're heavily using the document and showing me through your answers that you read and understood the information is the most important thing. So these two documents, I think, do an absolutely brilliant job of pointing out the differences between Sparta and Athens. It's one thing to read about the differences in a textbook, but I think it's another to actually read these documents and say, whoa, no, wait, actually this is where we're getting this information, and yeah, these differences are very, very pronounced. So looking at the Spartan government. The Spartan government, there's just a real brief quote here, or part in the beginning, where he talks about the forming of what he calls the Senate. Essentially, this is that group of a few prominent members of a society, essentially an oligarchy that is going to be running society, and it's kind of, as it's depicted here, as a middle ground. He says, the state, which before had no firm basis to stand upon, but leaned one while towards an absolute monarchy, when the kings had the upper hand, and another while towards a pure democracy, when the people had the better, found in this establishment of the Senate a central weight, a ballast in a ship, which always kept things just equilibrium. So the Senate kind of being a compromising between kingship. For example, of course, the Spartans keep the idea of kings, but they have two kings, right? Not just one king. And the kings are more kind of like military leaders, where you have one king who is supposed to, if the Spartan army needs to go out of Sparta, can lead the Spartan army out of the state, and the other king stays in Sparta and makes sure that the Helots don't revolt. I mean, that's essentially the main purpose for having two kings. If the Spartans ever want to have to go anywhere outside with their army, there needs to be another army still in Sparta, because, of course, as we discussed earlier, what is Sparta's number one concern at all times? Making sure that they control their slave population. So that is why you are seeing that idea of the dual king model. But behind that dual king model is that idea of the Senate, that central weight that they're talking about, that is kind of an oligarchy that is going to help run Spartan society. Contrast this then to Athens' government, where Pericles says, our constitution does not copy the laws of neighboring states. Well, they're certainly not copying the Spartans, we know that. We are rather a pattern to others, imitators ourselves, as of course some other Greek city-states do adopt a similar style of government. Its administration favors the many instead of the few. In some cases, yes. In some cases, maybe not. This is why it is called a democracy. So you can see right here kind of the official statement, let's say, of both Athens and Sparta of what their government system is. What's more interesting, though, of course, is the details of society that both of these documents provide. And of course, a lot of what we talked about, the social engineering part of Sparta society, is detailed right here in this document. For example, in order to the good education of their youth, which, as I said before, he thought, talking about Lycurgus here, most important and noblest work of a lawgiver, he went so far back as to take into consideration the very conception and birth by regulating their marriages. Of course, a lot of the Spartan marriages were essentially arranged marriages. Neither of the participants had much say in it. A lot of times they probably or may not have even known each other prior to the marriage, and that the marriages are really once more kind of formed to try to get the strongest possible match and parents and babies that they could. As soon as they were 7 years old, talking about Spartan children, they were to be enrolled in certain companies and classes where they all lived under the same order and discipline, doing their exercises and taking their play together. So essentially from the year 7 and older, they were removed from their families, removed from their mothers, and raised in kind of this communal setting to drill into them the Spartan lifestyle. And of course, it even goes until after they are done with this kind of period of service. Their discipline continued still after they were full-grown men. No one was allowed to live after his own fancy, but the city was a sort of camp in which every man had his share of provisions and business set out and looked upon, not so much born to serve his own ends or interest of his country. So that because they were indoctrinated through this process, even once they were own men, they didn't just do what they wanted. They were still essentially part of the rest of this kind of societal machine that the Spartans had set up. And I think this quote does an excellent job of showing kind of the entire life cycle, so to speak, of a Spartan and how they were never above the state. They were always subservient to the state or to the country for the express purpose of making sure they could continue to dominate the Helots, keep them under thumb, protect the rest of Spartan society from any other threats that might be out there, for example, the Athenians or the Persians, but that this was always their main primary focus and primary goal. Athenian society, incredibly different. The freedom which we enjoy in our government extends also to our ordinary life. Of course, we're talking about the freedom of democracy up here, and he's saying that the freedom doesn't just pertain to politics, but it extends to ordinary life as well. For example, at Athens, we live exactly as we please, and yet are just as ready to encounter every legitimate danger. Starkly different than saying no one from Sparta lived by their own fancy. In Athens, he's essentially saying, yeah, pretty much we all live by our own fancy to a certain degree. Unlike any other nation, regarding him who takes no part in these duties, not as unambitious, as useless, we Athenians are able to judge at all events if we cannot originate, and instead of looking on discussion as a stumbling block in the way of action, we think it an indispensable preliminary to any wise action. I think this is also very telling, because what he's really saying here is that the Athenians are able to judge events for themselves. They use discussion not as a stumbling block, not as a bad thing, but as a way of creating and choosing wise action. I think you really see how that ties into the political aspect of Athens, but also the societal aspect as well, as Athens has a much more leeway and much more freedom of its members than Sparta actually did. Of course, the idea of equality came up a lot between Athens and Sparta, and it's interesting how I think both of these documents try to make the case that Spartan society or Athenian society believed in this idea of equality, and they were both fighting for it. In Sparta, he says, for the rich had no advantage over the poor, as their wealth and abundance had no road to come abroad by, but were shut up at home doing nothing. And this gets back to the idea I talked about earlier, because there really was no sense of wealth and economic disparity within Sparta. Yeah, between the Spartans themselves, there was a lot of equality. But the Athenians were saying, we value this too. If he says, if we look at the laws, they afford equal justice to all in their private differences. If no social standing, advancement in public life falls to reputation for capacity, class considerations not being allowed to interfere with merit, nor again does poverty bar the way. If a man is able to serve the state, he is not hindered by the obscurity of his condition. Once more, you kind of have to take this with a grain of salt. This might not always be as true as Pericles wants to make it here in his declaration. There were a lot of wealth disparities, and that did inhibit a lot of people from participating in Athenian politics. But the very idea that they had that ideology and that ideal, I think, is something to take into consideration as well, even if they didn't necessarily always live up to that ideal, in the same way that the Spartans certainly enforced that idea of commonality between all their people. Of course, luxury, or the idea of luxury, I think is touched upon in both these, and a lot of people brought this up as a big difference between them as two. In Sparta, he says Lycurgus. In the next place, he declared an outlawry of all needless and superfluous art. Stumbling my words here. Superfluous art. But there he might almost have spared his proclamation, essentially going on to say that because the Spartans did not essentially engage in this anyways, he didn't really even have to say anything, but there was an outlaw of it within Sparta anyways. Incredibly different than in Athens here. We see further, we provide plenty of means for the mind to refresh itself from business. We celebrate games and sacrifices all year round, and celebrate of our private establishments forms a daily source of pleasure. So a very different sense you get between the role of kind of luxury or restfulness between the two. Sparta, of course, much more stark. Athens, of course, seeming here much more open. So question 2, do these documents give any hints as to how and why these two city-states developed such different cultures, despite both belonging to a broader Greek culture and only separated by 130 miles? And a lot of people, you had trouble picking out specific examples here, so I wanted certainly to do that. But this is one of those questions where you probably had to use the knowledge you had gained from the book, use the knowledge from the videos, and then find the places in the documents where you see evidence of that. For example, in Sparta, they refer to the Helots in this. They say the Helots tilled their grounds for them, meaning the Spartans, and paid them yearly in kind the appointed quantity, essentially saying the Helots paid the appointed quantity to the Spartans to keep them going without any trouble of theirs. So essentially saying the Helots were not a problem at this point in time, but of course we talked about earlier how important it was to the rest of Spartan society to try to keep a strong army to make sure that the Helots were not going to try to change this arrangement. And of course, because that is one of the reasons, or perhaps like I said, the driving reason why Sparta becomes such a militaristic society, I think you have to say that that's one of the main ways that this document shows that difference. For example, then on the other side, Athens, really talking about kind of what their individuals and what their men do. He says, our public men, and important, of course, here he's talking only about men, not about women, and how that was certainly part of the kind of the equality aspect of this too. But he says, our public men have, besides politics, their private affairs to attend to, and our ordinary citizens, though occupied with the pursuits of industry, are still fair judges of public manners. So as opposed to Sparta, where everyone had to be kind of part of a support system to the state, in Athens, he's saying the public men have their own private affairs, they have their own businesses, they have their own industry, but at the same point in time, they're still fair judges and they're still involved in public matters or in the state as well. So a very different attitude you see between Sparta and Athens here. Another example where I see this in Sparta, Lycurgus says Plutarch says, so was now no more means of purchasing foreign goods and small wares. Merchants sent no shiploads into Laconian ports, certainly Spartan ports. No rhetoric master, no erudite fortune teller, no harlot monger, or gold or silversmith, engraver, or jeweler set foot in a country which had no money, so that luxury, deprived little by little of what fed and fermented it, wasted to nothing and died away itself. So really showing the isolated nature of Sparta here, right? One of the reasons why Sparta is able to form this incredibly isolated social engineering system was that they were very isolated, and that they were isolated by essentially having really no reason for anyone to come bother them. They didn't have any money, they didn't trade with anyone, so that, he says really that any kind of luxury that there was within the country, little by little, died over time. And you got to remember that they're thinking things here like, silverware and bowls and things like that as being a luxury, even to the point of, like I said, swords and any kind of craftsmanship within Sparta ends up breaking down over time, and this essentially is providing evidence to that. Partially due to their isolation and their refusal to trade, and partially because that's not just something they valued within their culture. Athens, of course, the complete opposite. We throw our city open to the world, and never by alien acts exclude foreigners from any opportunity of learning or observing, while the magnitude of our city draws the produce of the world into our harbor, so that the Athenian the fruits of other countries are as familiar luxury as those of his own. Of course, the idea of luxury here can be compared right back up here to the Spartan idea of it, and another comparison can be made there, but really showing how, as isolated as Sparta was, Athens is equally interconnected and kind of cosmopolitan and economically integrated into the Mediterranean world. Once more, finishing up the kind of stark contrast between these two city-states. So question 3, given the choice, which of these two ancient Greek city-states would you prefer to live in and why? And this is really just your own opinion based upon the answers to question 1 and 2 and all the other information we learned this week. And you gave some really good explanations and reasons for both of these. Some people really liked the order, the discipline, and the equality that could have been offered in Sparta, at least equality between the various groups. Of course, I'm assuming that we're assuming that you would not have been born a Helot in Sparta, and you would have been born a Spartan in Sparta. That would have made a huge difference there. But also, a lot of women, or some women, were saying that, well, because they had a much higher standing in society in Sparta, that would have given them reason to be part of that as well. There are plenty of other women in the class who said, well, despite that, I still would not want to be a part of that, where infanticide was an issue, where I'd be losing my children at a young age. That sounds like that'd be absolutely awful, and that they didn't think the additional freedom would necessarily be worth the sacrifices. Other people said that they would choose Athens. They liked it being a little bit more open, a little bit more cosmopolitan, the idea of trade. But at the same point in time, other people pointed out that there was more inequality within Athens. How some people made the argument that Athens was kind of militarily weaker than Sparta, and that's not necessarily true, actually. I think it's easy to think, because Sparta was so kind of gung-ho about their military, that they were just kind of automatically the stronger force. But if you look at Athens, they had a very, very strong military record themselves. Like I said, they beat the Persian army in the Battle of Marathon. Naval battles, they beat the much larger Persian navy at the Battle of Salamis. They helped then at the Battle of Plataea, teaming up with the Spartans actually to push the Persians out, and they defeated the Spartans many times in the Peloponnesian War. Because the Peloponnesian War drug on for like 50 years, I think it was more like 30, but you get the point. Because it was so long, it's easy to see periods in time where Athens seemed stronger and had the upper hand, and times when Sparta seemed stronger and had the upper hand. And oftentimes the determining factor wasn't necessarily Athens or Sparta themselves, it was the kind of the coalition that they were able to form around them. Where at some point in time, Athens had more city-states on their side and were able to be more effective attacking Sparta and its city-states, and sometimes Sparta had more city-states and more alliances on their side and were better equipped to attack Athens. So I don't know if you can necessarily look at that as one of the determining factors. But I think a lot of people gave really, really excellent reasons for why they chose each side, either the Spartans or the Athens. And I think, like I said, these two documents did an absolutely excellent job of pointing out these differences and gives you a really good idea of the different kind of cultures which were developed within these Greek city-states. All right, I am done. Thank you all very much for sticking with me, for listening. I hope you found it informative. Once more, if you have any questions about the reflection, about the review, about your grades, about anything else, let me know. I love talking. I love talking. You all know that by now, right? Yeah, let me know. I'll help you out. I want to see you all succeed. Thanks a lot. Have a great week.